Hello and welcome to A Fountain of Useless Information, a micro podcast hosted by Ann O'Connor. Each 15-minute episode will feature a person, much like yourself, who knows something unusual, interesting, and maybe even zany that is near and dear to their heart. Today, on A Fountain of Useless Information, we'll be learning from Joe Sheppard about trolleys, one of the first forms of mass transportation within cities and from city to city. What is a trolley car? Why did we have them?
Okay, well, a trolley car or a streetcar, or what the rest of the world has always called a tram, is nowadays an electric vehicle that runs on rails, usually in the streets, although there were interurban ones that went between the cities. The first public transportation, of course, in cities was omnibuses, which just ran in the street. And then some smart person figured out that they could put tracks down the middle of the street and have cars pulled by horses, which were very popular from probably the 1840s up to the really end of the 19th century. They overlapped. But they were expensive. Horses were expensive to maintain. And needless to say, it was kind of messy. The city streets weren't exactly a joy to behold in those days. So in the 1880s, when electricity became generally available, several people began to experiment with electric horse cars. A gentleman named Frank Sprague, who was a brilliant engineer, was a graduate of the Naval Academy, and they had him working on various other things, but his main interest was in motors. And he designed electric motors that could run at variable speeds, but he built the first practical electric street railway, which came online in Richmond, Virginia in 1887. It was the Richmond Union Passenger Railway. He invented the most practical method of current collection. Turned out to be an overhead line running 600 volts DC. The current returned through the tracks, so the rails all had to be a perfect electrical circuit, too. He invented the trolley pole, which is the spring-loaded pole overhead that goes up and collects the current off the wire. Sprague built the first passenger railway in 1886-87, and it was highly successful. A couple of years into the Richmond thing, some people from Boston came down. 1889. They were impressed by this, and Boston, of course, had a huge horse car network. So the people from Boston decided they'd try electrifying, and in 1889, the first streetcar line, electrified, opened in Boston. I don't know where it was. In those days, of course, there were no subways, but it was highly successful, and it expanded very rapidly. The first subway in the United States, I think the second one in the world, actually. Boston had become so congested around Boylston and Tremont Streets in the middle of town that it was decided in the late 1890s to put the trolley tracks underground. So they built a subway from Boylston Street. It was only about 2-3 blocks long from down Boylston Street around a big curve, and it came out in Scully Square. That was the original subway.
So is that the big curve that you always kind of grit your teeth on the Green Line?
That's the big curve that if you go inbound from out Commonwealth Avenue or wherever, and you hear that god-awful screeching going around, that's the original subway, yes. And it hasn't been remodeled. Boylston Street Station has never been touched. That took a huge load off the surface traffic. Gradually, the subway, of course, it was expanded. Boston, at its height, probably in the late teens, early 1920s, Boston had the most extensive street railway network in the country. It's almost 600 miles of track. There's probably about 50 now. I don't know exactly what it is. But every line, every street in the city had a streetcar line, and you could get anywhere on it. If you look at a map, I have a very old map from 1907 of southern New England and all the trolley networks. You could get from one place to another. It might take you 12 hours. You could go from Boston to Portland, Maine, which nowadays is about an hour and a half on the train, by trolley. It took you 5 or 6 hours, and you had to change a half a dozen times. There were a couple of true interurban lines which really crisscrossed the Midwest in the heyday in the early 20th century. But the Boston and Worcester, which ended up as a bus company, was originally an interurban trolley line from Boston to Worcester with branches over to Natick and a branch off in Southborough at White's Corner, which went over through Southborough and Marlborough to Hudson. The cars on interurbans are much bigger and heavier, longer, and faster than city streetcars. And the B&W called itself the trolley airline, and I think at its peak, not long after World War I, it took about an hour and 50 minutes to get from Boston to Worcester. It was about 60 cents to go that whole way. That service lasted until 1932. Cars were taking over, of course. They could all afford to buy cars. So the ridership gradually went down, but there were still patches of trolley tracks down the main street of Marlborough when I was a kid. The last streetcar ran from Framingham to Worcester in 1931. And then a year and a half later, the last one from Boston to Framingham ran. And from then on, it was a bus company. And the last remaining car of the Boston and Worcester, which was number 149, I remember seeing at somebody's house on Route 20 in Wayland when I was a young kid, probably 1950. Of course, it was a wreck. The Seashore Museum rescued that, which was nothing but a hulk. It had no electrical equipment, no trucks, no headlights, no controllers, no nothing. And that's sitting up at the museum, covered in tarps. They did put a pair of trucks on it, and they have the electrical equipment. But someday, when they have lots of money, they'll restore that, and it'll be the only remaining car of the Boston and Worcester.
So can we talk a little bit about how the development of both probably the horse-drawn trolleys and the electric trolleys changed the picture of American life?
Well, they changed, particularly the electric ones. The horse cars were slow. They weren't any faster than taking your own horse and buggy somewhere. But when electric streetcars began to be built, of course, the companies wanted to make money. So they would build lines out into what appeared to be virgin territory, no houses, no roads, no nothing, or just a road maybe. And at the end of a lot of the lines, to make money, they built amusement parks to generate traffic, particularly on the weekends when ridership was slow. Wayland Park, locally here in Fitchburg, or is it in Leominster?
Kind of Lunenburg.
Lunenburg. It's in Lunenburg. Anyway, the late lamented Wayland Park, where I used to take my kids when they were very small.
And did you have a whale of a time?
I had a whale of a time. Never got on the roller coaster. But that was built by the Fitchburg and Leominster Street Railway to attract riders. That was the end of the line. I have an old friend, grew up and lived and died in Ashby, who remembered taking the trolley out there as a kid. Canopy Lake Park up in Salem, New Hampshire, was built by I think it was the Massachusetts Northeastern Street Railway to draw people from Lowell, Lawrence, Nashua up to there in 1902. That started. Down in Rhode Island, there Crescent Park and Rocky Point were trolley parks. There used to be like 1,500 of them in the country. But other than that, they built lines out into the country. And gradually, of course, now that people saw they didn't have to live downtown, but could live in a nice green area and take the trolley to work, they began to build homes out there. And the suburbs grew up that way. I mean, if you look at Brookline, Newton, Wellesley, those were trolley suburbs originally. Medford, Stoneham, all around Boston. Locally here, even towns like Lunenburg that had trolley service, or Leominster, they were connected by trolley. So places that had been empty of people were now, they were called streetcar suburbs. And every big city had them. So in a very real sense, the streetcar was responsible for the growth, development, design, if you will, of modern cities. I first got liking trolley cars. This is sort of silly, but my grandparents lived, starting when I was about 6, they moved from another place in Brookline, Mass. To Beacon Street, which is right on the Green Line. And my parents used to dump me with my grandparents for a weekend every now and then when I was a little kid before my brother was born. They'd go off on the weekend and have fun. And my grandmother, whom we all called Gammy, because I couldn't say Grammy, being the oldest kid, I couldn't say my R's. She'd take me on the trolley in town, And we'd go shopping at Jordan Marsh, and she'd buy me a toy. And that involved a subway ride, which was exciting. And then we'd go downstairs to what they used to call Park Street Under, which is now the Red Line, of course. And we'd take the Red Line to Washington Street, where all the shopping was. And there's this huge subterranean bunch of tunnels that connected the department stores. It was a great place to explore. But I vividly remember one of the first times I had to go on the subway car in Park Street Under. You had to step from the platform onto the car, and there was a gap of about 4 inches. And I was terrified, of course, because my grandmother had always told me about the third rail. Don't touch the third rail, dearie, you'll get electrocuted. I was terrified to step across that little place. She finally had to pick me up and stick me into the car, which is one of those marvelous old Pullman standard heavy growling machines. I love the sound in the subway. But that's how I got to like trolleys. And when I was a little older, she'd give me a quarter, get rid of me for the morning, say, here, go take a trolley ride. And I'd go up to Cleveland Circle or to Commonwealth Avenue all the way out to BC or the end of Huntington Avenue and all that stuff. And our biggest adventure that way was in 1956. We had 3 friends who'd grown up in the summer together. And I read that one of the last of the country lines, which went out the Fellsway in Medford and used to go all the way around Spot Pond into Stoneham, was going to be converted to buses. So we had to ride the trolley out there, 1956. So my parents foolishly, or trustingly, can you imagine doing this now, let me go by myself from my grandparents' apartment in Brookline all the way to Sullivan Square on the elevated, and then we took the trolley to the end of the line. It had been cut off at the end of the Fellsway in 1939 or 40, and back again. Once we got to the end of the line, we walked the roadbed of the part that had been torn up years and years before up to the trestle. There's a big trestle. You can still see it if you drive up 93 and look to your left on Spot Pond. There's a big concrete trestle off in the woods where the trolleys used to cross. Anyway, there was a horrible accident on that trestle sometime around 1939. Supposedly, at least according to my grandfather's version, a streetcar fell off into the pond and somebody died. So they abandoned it beyond the end of Elm Street in the Fellsway. I had on a brand new double-breasted overcoat that my parents had just given me. It was a November day we did this. And I managed to catch it on a fence post on that old roadbed and tear the hell out of the front of it, which my mother did not appreciate. But that was our biggest adventure. Since then, I only get to ride the trolley about once or twice a year when I go into Boston with my brother to the Copley Plaza to pretend we're rich for a couple of days. What else?
Well, when you arrived here, you gave me the path that you would have taken to get from your house in Pepperell to the downtown Fitchburg area.
Oh, yeah. Probably would have taken me 2 hours. We live about 2 miles from the former railroad station in East Pepperell Square. Anyway, if this had been like 1908 or 10, I could have gotten in my horse and buggy, driven a couple of miles to the railroad station in East Pepperell Square, taken a train back to Air, which would have taken probably 25 minutes or so, and then switched to a trolley on Main Street in Air and come over here to Fitchburg. Probably could have gotten off somewhere quite near this studio. I imagine the whole thing would have taken me probably 2.5 hours or so and might have cost me something like 40 cents.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, Ann. This has been a lot of fun.
I've enjoyed it. You can visit the Seashore Trolley Museum by going online to trolleymuseum.org. A Fountain of Useless Information is hosted, produced, and edited by Ann O'Connor. Do you have an idea for the podcast? You can reach Ann through her website, annoc.com, ANNEOC.com, on Facebook at Our History AOC, or by calling or texting 978-958-0054. All music on the podcast is in the public domain or is written and performed by the host and guests of the podcast. A Fountain of Useless Information was recorded at the Fitchburg Access Television Studios in Fitchburg. They are on the web at fatv.org. www.fitchburg.org.